It was past midnight in the quiet hills of Arizona. The rain whispered against the tall glass windows of billionaire Richard Hale's mansion, each droplet echoing the emptiness of his home. The faint sound of thunder rolled over the desert and the scent of wet earth filled the air. Richard had just returned from a long trip to New York. Another deal signed, another empire expanded. Yet as he stood in his marble kitchen pouring himself a glass of whiskey, a dull ache pressed against his chest. Wealth had given him everything, except peace. He walked slowly across the hall, his footsteps echoing in the vast silence. The mansion was enormous, yet it felt suffocating. Photographs of his late wife hung on the walls, reminders of a love lost too soon. He often wondered when his life had stopped feeling real. The noise of the world, the flashing cameras, the boardroom applause never reached his heart anymore. He was a man who had everything but felt nothing, and on that rainy night as the storm outside deepened, fate decided to remind him that even the richest hearts can be shaken. A sudden knock echoed down the hallway, sharp and unexpected. Richard froze. The clock read 12:43 a.m. No one came to his house unannounced, especially not in weather like this. The security gates were miles down the road, guarded and locked. He set his drink down, the ice clinking softly, and turned toward the door. The knock came again, softer this time, almost pleading. His instincts told him to ignore it, but something deeper urged him to look. He slowly opened the door. Rain lashed against the porch as a cold gust of wind rushed inside. And there, beneath the flickering porch light, stood a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7. Her long black hair was soaked, clinging to her face. Her thin cotton dress was torn, her small feet bare against the wet ground. Tears mixed with the rain on her cheeks. Richard's breath caught in his throat. She looked up at him, eyes wide and glistening with fear. "Please, sir," she whispered, her voice shaking. "My brother is dying. He needs help." For a long moment, Richard couldn't move. The child looked so fragile, so desperate that it pierced through the wall he had built around his heart. He wanted to ask how she got past the gates, where she came from, but her trembling lips and hollow eyes silenced every question. Without thinking, he grabbed his coat from the rack, slipped it over his shoulders, and stepped into the storm. "Show me," he said, his voice low but firm. The girl nodded quickly and turned toward the dark stretch of desert road. The rain came down harder as they hurried through the night. The desert, usually so dry and lifeless, now seemed alive with sound. The rustle of wet brush, the crack of thunder, the splash of puddles beneath their feet. Richard's expensive shoes were soaked within minutes, but he didn't care. His heart raced as the little girl led him down a narrow dirt path, her small hand gripping his tightly. The wind howled through the canyons and lightning flashed, illuminating the distant outline of what looked like an old camp. They reached a cluster of abandoned tents near a rusted water tank. The air smelled of smoke and decay. In the corner, beneath a torn blanket, lay a boy, thin, pale, and barely breathing. Richard knelt beside him, his heart pounding. The boy's lips were cracked, his skin burning with fever. "When did this happen?" Richard asked softly. The girl wiped her tears with trembling fingers. "He hasn't eaten for 2 days. I didn't know where else to go." Richard quickly pulled off his coat and wrapped it around the boy. "We're taking him to the hospital," he said firmly. He lifted the child carefully into his arms, feeling the boy's faint heartbeat against his chest. The girl followed close behind as they ran toward his car, the rain pouring harder with every step. By the time they reached the mansion's driveway, Richard's heart felt different, alive for the first time in years. He didn't know who these children were or where they came from. All he knew was that somehow in the middle of a stormy night, a little girl had knocked on his door and awakened the part of him that had long been asleep. As he placed the boy gently in the back seat and turned on the engine, lightning flashed again, casting brief light over the desert. In that moment, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but he pressed the accelerator, determined to outrun the storm and the ghosts of his past. The mansion lights faded behind him, swallowed by darkness, as the car disappeared into the rain toward the unknown, and toward something that might finally heal his soul. 4 days had passed since the stormy night that changed Richard Hale's life. The mansion was silent again, but the silence felt different now, heavier, almost alive. Richard sat in his study, the faint glow of a fireplace casting long shadows on the walls. On the desk before him lay a small carved stone, the same one the little girl had left behind. The symbol etched into it was simple yet powerful, the sacred mark of the Apache tribe. He couldn't stop staring at it. Each groove, each line seemed to whisper something ancient, something beyond his understanding. The memory of the child's frightened eyes still haunted him. He remembered how he had found the boy, barely breathing, burning with fever, yet still clutching that stone as if it were his only lifeline. Richard had rushed him to the nearest clinic 30 miles away, refusing to leave until the boy's condition stabilized. For hours he had sat by the bedside, holding the boy's fragile hand and watching the rise and fall of his chest. Something about that child stirred a forgotten tenderness within him. But when Richard returned the next morning, the bed was empty. The nurses were confused. There was no sign of who had taken him or how they'd gotten past the staff. The only thing left behind was Richard's coat and that carved stone resting on the pillow. Since that morning, Richard hadn't slept properly. The quiet hum of the desert wind outside his mansion only deepened his restlessness. At night he thought he heard faint voices, the echo of children's laughter fading through the halls. He told himself it was just his imagination, but deep down he knew something greater was at work. Guilt and curiosity battled within him. Who were those children? Why had they come to him? He tried to research the Apache symbol online, but nothing matched. It was as if the stone carried a meaning lost to time. On the fourth night, as the sun dipped behind the red cliffs painting the horizon in fire, Richard sat by his study window with a glass of untouched whiskey. The carved stone sat on his palm, warm despite the evening chill. Then, just as the first stars appeared, a knock echoed through the house. Slow, heavy, familiar. His pulse quickened. Memories of that first night rushed back, the rain, the girl, the trembling voice. But tonight the air was dry and still. He rose quietly and walked toward the door, each step echoing in the vast emptiness. When he opened it, he froze. Standing on his porch were 3 Apache women. Their long braids glistened under the moonlight, and their faces, lined by both age and strength, carried a calm dignity. They wore traditional shawls woven with desert colors, red, gold, and earth brown. Richard felt as though time had stopped. The eldest of the 3 stepped forward, her eyes deep and knowing. "You saved one of ours," she said softly, her voice as gentle as the desert wind. "But remember, some debts are written not in gold, but in spirit." Her words sank deep into Richard's chest, carrying a weight he couldn't describe. Before he could speak, she reached into a small leather pouch and placed it in his hand. "He remembers," she whispered, and for a brief moment Richard thought he saw tears in her eyes. Then, without another word, the women turned and walked away, quietly, gracefully, until the desert swallowed their silhouettes. Richard stood frozen at the doorway, clutching the pouch, listening to the distant sound of wind sweeping across the sands. He didn't call out to them. Something in his heart told him not to. He walked back inside, his hands trembling as he opened the pouch. Inside was the same carved stone he had left on his desk, but now it was glowing faintly. A soft golden light pulsed from within as if it were alive, breathing. Richard stared in awe. The glow illuminated his face, and for the first time in years he felt something pure. Peace. A single tear slipped down his cheek. He didn't understand what the stone truly meant, but he knew one thing. His life would never be the same. That night, Richard placed the glowing stone on his windowsill. Outside, the desert was still. Far in the distance, he thought he saw 3 figures standing beneath the moonlight, watching him, guarding him. He blinked and they were gone. The storm, the fear, the emptiness, all had faded into something larger, something sacred. As he turned off the lights and looked one last time at the stone, he whispered to himself, "Some debts are written in spirit." The stone shimmered faintly in response, and for the first time in his lonely life, Richard Hale felt truly connected, not to wealth, not to power, but to something eternal.